Welcome to the podcast related to the qualitative and quantitative tool for the selection of CMC CMOs. The CMO selection and the smooth technical transfer of the product are critical to a company. Therefore, we are highly recommending to define pre-acceptance criteria for the selection of the right CDMO. For example, we can decide that the FDA past experience is very critical for the selection of the site, as well as very good experience in GMP, scale-up, tech transfer. The location can be potentially very critical for a company. It is essential for a company to decide for the selection of the proper CDMO and to make it the first time right. Otherwise, it is obvious to all of us that it's going to be very expensive and time consuming. So what we are recommending here is to build a qualitative and a quantitative tool to avoid any biased decision in that process and to ensure as well a successful technical transfer. Let's discuss right now how we are proposing to initiate the CDMO selection. Let's start from a broad list. This broad list could be built from our previous experience or from the other consultant that we are working with. From this broad list, we will narrow down the list to a shorter list because obviously we don't want to send so many requests for proposal. And by the way, the request for proposal should be very well defined. We should include the most possible information to be shared with the CDMO so they can build a right quote. Once we receive the quote, we will initiate discussion with the CDMOs through teleconference or emails to narrow down the scope of work, to explain what was not clear, and to define the right timelines for the finalization of the quote. Before we can take any decision about which CDMO we want to sign off, we need to go for a pre-visit on site and to do a further assessment of the capabilities and capacities of the CDMO. Once we finished this pre-assessment on site, we can come back and prepare a report. This report will be defined and designed as we will see in the next slide. The selection of the suitable CDMO is based on a matrix with acceptance criteria. And as you can see, this matrix is built from different topics. And for example, we decided to look at the cost of ownership, the QA aspects, the competencies, the supplier perception of our company, and the potential risk we have with deciding to choose one and not another CDMO. For each of these topics, we are including subtopics. And let's take, for example, the cost of ownership. We don't look just at the total cost of the project, but we're going to look at the cost, for example, of one batch, an engineering batch, a clinical batch, a primary stability batch. We look at and compare the stability cost, for example, and obviously if our product is requiring a different set of equipment, maybe there is a cost for the capex, and that should be also compared between different CDMOs. So those different acceptance criteria will be built in, and we will provide for each of these acceptance criteria a weight. So a certain percentage that we believe that is critical for the process. In our case, we decided that the cost of ownership will take 30% of the overall estimation. QA aspect 10%, not only 10% because it's not important, but we have already pre-selected the CDMOs based on their QA experience and the fact that they were FDA approved. So QA is important, but is not the most critical aspect of the decision. because it was already built in. The competencies in that case were very important. We put 20% of the weight, and our supplier perception of the sponsor. So in the case of looking at the total cost of ownership, we will plug for each of the CMO a mark, which for example for that case will be between 0 to 10, 0 being the highest total cost of ownership and 10 being the lowest one. And we will give for each of the CMO a mark, and the total of this mark will be the total cost of ownership for each CDMO. So we will continue to give marks for each of the potential attributes that we have defined, predefined. So for example, the total cost of ownership, the QA, the competencies, etc. And based on the mark we've given and the pre-weight we have given for each of these attributes, we will get a score. This score will be the weighted score, as you can see in this slide, and at the end of the day, the total weighted score will give a final mark for each CDMO. And this mark will be, for us, the tool, the quantitative tool, to define whether we want to choose CDMO 1, 2, or 3. Based on this preliminary assessment, the recommendation is to go on-site to the CDMOs and to have a discussion face-to-face, to perform an on-site tour to understand exactly what are the capabilities and capacities of the CDMO, to discuss with the SMEs, and to really drill down into the project as it was quoted, to understand and to align timelines, expectation, etc. We are highly recommending to perform a summary report upon completion of these on-site visits, so to make sure we have a correct report of what we have been observing during this discussion. Once we have completed the on-site visit, we highly recommend to fill again the matrix. And in that example, we are looking at 3 different CDMOs. If you look at the score, the difference in the score is not very different, and this is logical because we were pre-selecting very good CDMOs. Now let's look at what we have in that table. Since the overall score are not apparently very different, it is necessary to review the individual attribute scores. CDMO number 3, for example, was not in compliance. His QA result was called weighted score 0. The total cost of ownership is slightly better, for example, for CDMO number 2, but significantly better compared to CDMO number 1, 9.3 versus 7.8. And if we were only judging by cost, CDMO number 2 and number 3 are quite similar. But since CDMO number 3 got a very bad score on a QA, we can understand that we are suggesting that CDMO number 2 will be selected. In conclusion, attributes and acceptance criteria should be predefined ahead of the selection program. Those attributes and acceptance criteria are totally depending on the program and on the sponsor. This is our decision to define what is the most important attribute and what kind of acceptance criteria we are providing for each attribute. And the total score is helping us to decide in a non-biased way what CDMO should be selected.